So this happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still processing it. My wife basically moved her mother into our house without asking me first. Like, I came home from work one day, and there were suitcases in the hallway and my mother-in-law sitting on our couch like she owned the place. My wife just looked at me and said it was temporary. But then I found out she was trying to register her mom at our address permanently. The thing is, the lease is only in my name, so I had some leverage. I know it sounds harsh, but sometimes you have to draw lines. The whole situation blew up our marriage, and now we're separated. Looking back, maybe I could have handled it differently, but I wasn't about to let someone make major decisions about my home without consulting me. So I'm Daniel, 32, accountant. I work at a mid-sized firm downtown. Nothing fancy, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy during tax season. I've been married to Sarah for about 4 years now, and we rent this nice 2-bedroom place in the suburbs. It's got a decent kitchen and a small yard, perfect for just the two of us. Sarah's always been close with her mom, Linda, which I generally didn't mind. Linda's in her late 50s and has been on her own since her divorce about 3 years ago. She lives about an hour away in this tiny apartment, and Sarah visits her pretty regularly. I always thought it was sweet how they maintained their relationship, even if Linda could be a bit much sometimes. The thing about our living situation is that when we moved in 2 years ago, I was the only one with steady employment. Sarah was between jobs at the time, so the lease went in my name only. We never really thought about changing it later when she found work at the local library. It just seemed like paperwork we didn't need to deal with. Our place isn't huge, but it works for us. We've got our bedroom, a spare room that Sarah uses as a home office, and the common areas. Everything has its place, and we've built this comfortable routine over the years. I guess I took that stability for granted until everything changed. I never imagined that our quiet little life would get turned upside down by a few suitcases in the hallway. I remember that Tuesday evening like it was yesterday. I'd had a particularly long day at the office dealing with a client's messy bookkeeping, and all I wanted was to get home, grab a beer, and maybe watch some TV with Sarah. Traffic was worse than usual, so I didn't get home until almost 7. The first thing I noticed when I walked through the front door was the luggage. 3 large suitcases were lined up against the wall in our narrow hallway, along with a couple of shopping bags and what looked like a small cooler. My first thought was that Sarah was planning some surprise trip, maybe a weekend getaway she'd forgotten to mention. But then I heard voices coming from the living room. Sarah's voice, and another one that I recognized immediately. I walked into the living room, and there was Linda, my mother-in-law, sitting comfortably on our couch with a cup of tea in her hands. She was wearing this floral dress and had her reading glasses on, looking through what appeared to be our local newspaper. Sarah was sitting in the armchair across from her, and when she saw me, she got this weird expression on her face. Not guilty exactly, but definitely uncomfortable. Linda looked up and gave me this bright smile, like nothing unusual was happening. I stood there for a moment, trying to process the scene. The suitcases, Linda with tea, Sarah's nervous energy. Something was definitely going on, but I couldn't quite figure out what. Sarah finally spoke up and told me that her mom was going to be staying with us for a while. She explained that Linda's apartment building was having some major plumbing issues and that the whole place was basically uninhabitable. She said the landlord told all the tenants they needed to find temporary housing while repairs were being done. Linda nodded along and added that the building manager estimated it would take at least a few weeks, maybe longer depending on how extensive the damage was. She thanked me for letting her stay and said she really appreciated us opening our home to her. I was caught completely off guard. This was the first I was hearing about any of this. Sarah hadn't mentioned anything about her mom's housing situation, and we definitely hadn't discussed having a long-term house guest. I looked at Sarah, hoping for some kind of explanation or apology for not running this by me first. But Sarah just gave me this look that said we'd talk about it later. She asked if I wanted some dinner and mentioned that Linda had brought groceries and cooked this big meal for all of us. The whole thing felt surreal, like I'd walked into someone else's house by mistake. I told them that sounded great and went to wash my hands, mostly because I needed a minute to think. Standing in our bathroom, looking at Linda's toiletries already arranged on the counter next to ours, I realized this wasn't going to be as temporary as they were making it sound. The next few days were an adjustment, to put it mildly. Linda had basically taken over our spare room, which meant Sarah's home office was now crammed into a corner of our bedroom. Her desk was pushed up against the window, and there were work papers scattered everywhere because she didn't have proper storage anymore. Linda was an early riser, so I'd come out for my morning coffee and she'd already be in the kitchen, making breakfast and humming to herself. She'd always offer to make me something, which was nice in theory, but I'm pretty particular about my morning routine. I like my coffee a certain way, and I usually just grab a piece of toast on my way out. But Linda would insist on making these elaborate breakfasts with eggs and bacon and fresh fruit cut up in little bowls. She'd set the table like we were having Sunday brunch every day. I didn't want to be rude, so I'd sit and eat while she chatted about her plans for the day or some show she'd watched the night before. The evenings were even more complicated. Sarah and I used to have this routine where we'd decompress from our days, maybe cook dinner together, watch something on Netflix. But now Linda was always there, wanting to be included in everything. She'd suggest we watch these old movies or game shows that neither Sarah nor I were really interested in. Our conversations became stilted and careful. Sarah and I couldn't really talk about work stuff or our friends because Linda would jump in with questions or stories about people we didn't know. Even simple things like deciding what to order for takeout became group discussions. I started noticing that Linda was making herself more and more at home. She'd rearranged some things in the kitchen to be more convenient for her. She moved our coffee maker to a different counter and reorganized the spice rack. Small things, but it felt like our space was slowly being taken over. The bathroom situation was probably the most frustrating part. We only have one full bathroom, and Linda had spread her stuff across most of the available counter space. She had this whole skincare routine that involved like 6 different products, and she'd leave them all out after using them. I tried talking to Sarah about it a few times, but she kept brushing off my concerns. She'd say her mom was just trying to be helpful or that it was only temporary, so we should just be patient. But I could see Sarah was getting stressed too. She was working longer hours at the library, and when she came home, she seemed tired and on edge. By the end of that first week, I realized that nobody had mentioned anything more about Linda's apartment repairs. I asked Sarah about it one evening, and she gave me this vague response about how these things take time and her mom was still waiting to hear from the building manager. Something about her answer didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. I figured maybe I was just being impatient and needed to give the situation more time. It was the following Wednesday when things started to become clearer. I'd taken a half day at work because I had a dentist appointment, so I got home around 2 in the afternoon. Sarah was still at work, and I expected Linda to be out running errands or something, but the house was quiet. I figured this was a good opportunity to relax in my own living room without having to make conversation. I grabbed a soda from the fridge and settled onto the couch with my laptop to catch up on some personal emails. That's when I noticed some papers scattered on the coffee table. They looked official, with letterheads and formal formatting. I wasn't trying to snoop, but they were right there in plain sight, and I could see they had our address printed on them. Curiosity got the better of me, so I took a closer look. The top document was from the post office, some kind of change of address form. Linda's name was at the top, and she was requesting that her mail be forwarded from her old apartment to our house. The form was dated from the previous week, which meant she'd filed it right after she moved in. Underneath that was something even more concerning. It was a voter registration form, also with Linda's name and our address. She was trying to officially establish residency at our place. There was also what looked like a form for updating her address with Social Security. I sat there staring at these papers, feeling this sinking sensation in my stomach. This wasn't temporary housing while her apartment got fixed. Linda was planning to move in permanently, and Sarah obviously knew about it. I heard a key in the front door and quickly put the papers back where I'd found them. Linda came in carrying grocery bags and seemed surprised to see me home early. She asked about my appointment and whether I was feeling okay, making small talk while she unpacked groceries in the kitchen. I watched her moving around our kitchen like she'd been there for years, not days. She knew where everything was, had her own little system for organizing things. This was someone who was settling in for the long haul. When Sarah got home that evening, I tried to bring up the subject casually. I asked her if she'd heard anything new about Linda's apartment situation. Sarah said she thought the repairs were taking longer than expected and that her mom might need to stay with us for a few more weeks. I pressed a little harder, asking if Linda had been in touch with her landlord recently or if there was a timeline for when she could move back. Sarah got defensive and asked why I was being so pushy about it. She said her mom was family and that we should be happy to help her out during a difficult time. The conversation ended there, but I could tell Sarah was uncomfortable. She spent the rest of the evening being unusually quiet, and when I tried to talk to her about other things, She gave short answers and seemed distracted. Later that night, after Linda had gone to bed, I considered confronting Sarah directly about the papers I'd seen. But something held me back. Maybe I wanted to see how far this would go, or maybe I was hoping I'd misunderstood what I'd seen. Either way, I decided to keep what I'd discovered to myself for now. By the weekend, the tension in the house was getting harder to ignore. Linda had started making comments about how nice it was to have family around and how lonely her old apartment had been. She talked about our neighborhood like she was planning to become a permanent part of it, mentioning the grocery store she liked and the walking route she'd discovered. Saturday morning, I finally decided I needed to have a real conversation with Sarah. Linda had gone out to run errands, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity. I found Sarah in our bedroom, folding laundry on the bed. I told her we needed to talk about her mom's living situation. I explained that I was feeling overwhelmed by the sudden change in our household and that I thought we should have discussed it before Linda moved in. I tried to keep my tone calm and reasonable, not wanting to start a fight. Sarah immediately got defensive. She said I was being selfish and that her mom needed our help. She reminded me that Linda had always been good to me and that family should come first. She accused me of caring more about my comfort than about helping someone in need. I tried to explain that it wasn't about not wanting to help Linda, but about the way the whole thing had been handled. I told Sarah that major decisions about our home should be made together, not unilaterally. I said I felt like my opinion didn't matter in my own house. That's when Sarah really lost it. She said I was being controlling and egotistical. She told me that the house was just as much hers as mine and that she had every right to invite her mother to stay. She said I was acting like some kind of dictator who needed to approve everything. The argument escalated quickly. Sarah brought up times when I'd made decisions without consulting her, like when I'd bought a new TV or changed our internet provider. She said I was being hypocritical and that I only cared about being consulted when it was something I didn't want. I tried to point out that those were minor purchases, not major life changes that affected our daily routine. But Sarah wasn't hearing it. She was getting more and more upset, and I could see that this conversation wasn't going anywhere productive. Then Linda came home. We heard her key in the door, and both went quiet immediately. Sarah wiped her eyes and started folding laundry again, pretending nothing had happened. I went to the living room and sat down with a magazine, trying to look casual. Linda came in with shopping bags and started telling us about her morning. She'd run into a neighbor at the grocery store and had a nice conversation about the neighborhood. She mentioned that the woman had invited her to join a book club that met at the community center. As I listened to Linda talk about making connections in our neighborhood, I realized that Sarah wasn't the only one who saw this as a permanent arrangement. Linda was already building a life here, making friends and establishing routines. The idea that this was temporary housing was becoming more and more obviously false. That evening, the three of us had dinner together, but the atmosphere was strained. Sarah barely looked at me, and I found myself making forced conversation with Linda while trying to process everything that had happened. The following Tuesday, I decided I needed some outside perspective on the situation. During my lunch break, I walked over to my friend Mike's office. He's a lawyer who handles real estate stuff, and I figured he might have some insight into where I stood legally. Mike's office is in one of those converted downtown buildings with high ceilings and exposed brick. He was between clients when I showed up, so he had time to grab coffee and listen to my story. I laid out the whole situation, from Linda's sudden arrival to the registration papers I'd found to Sarah's defensive reaction when I tried to discuss it. Mike listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and gave me this look that said he'd seen this kind of thing before. He told me that since the lease was in my name only, I technically had the legal right to determine who could live in the apartment. He explained that even though Sarah was my wife, the lease agreement was a contract between me and the landlord, and I was responsible for anyone else who lived there. But he also warned me that using the lease as leverage could seriously damage my marriage. He said that even if I was legally in the right, Sarah would probably see it as a betrayal. He asked me if I was prepared for the possibility that forcing the issue might end my relationship. I told him I wasn't sure what I was prepared for. I explained that I felt like Sarah had already betrayed me by making this decision without consulting me. I said it seemed like she cared more about her mother's comfort than about our partnership. Mike suggested that I try one more conversation with Sarah before taking any legal action. He said I should be completely honest about what I discovered and give her a chance to explain. He thought maybe there was more to the story that I didn't know about. But he also confirmed that if I wanted Linda to leave, the lease gave me the authority to make that happen. He said I could give her a reasonable notice period, maybe 30 days, and that would be legally sufficient. He warned me that it might create drama with the landlord if they found out about unauthorized tenants, but that was a separate issue. Walking back to my office after that conversation, I felt both relieved and terrified. Relieved that I had options, but terrified about what using those options might cost me. I'd never imagined that my marriage would come down to a legal document, but that's where we seemed to be heading. I spent the rest of the week thinking about what Mike had said. Part of me hoped that Sarah would bring up the subject herself, maybe admit that she'd handled things poorly, and suggest we work together on a solution. But she seemed determined to pretend that everything was normal and that Linda's presence was just a temporary inconvenience we all needed to tolerate. By Friday, I'd made up my mind. I was going to confront Sarah with what I knew and see if we could find a way forward. But I was also prepared to use the lease if necessary. I couldn't continue living in a situation where I felt like a guest in my own home. Saturday morning arrived with Linda making her usual elaborate breakfast. She'd gotten up early and prepared pancakes, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit salad. The kitchen smelled amazing, but I was too nervous about the conversation I planned to have with Sarah to really appreciate it. Sarah seemed to be in a better mood than she'd been all week. She was chatting with her mom about some movie they wanted to watch later and making plans for a shopping trip. Watching them together, I could see how natural and comfortable their relationship was, which made what I had to do even harder. After breakfast, Linda announced that she was going to visit a friend she'd met at the grocery store. She said they were going to look at some furniture stores and maybe have lunch. She seemed excited about her growing social circle in our neighborhood. Once Linda left, I asked Sarah if we could sit down and talk. She looked wary but agreed. We settled on the couch in the living room, and I took a deep breath before starting. I told Sarah that I'd seen the papers on the coffee table the previous week. I explained that I knew Linda was trying to change her address and register to vote at our house. I said it was clear that this wasn't a temporary arrangement while her apartment got repaired. Sarah's face went through several expressions: surprise, guilt, anger, and then defiance. She asked me why I'd been snooping through her mother's personal papers. She said I had no right to go through things that didn't belong to me. I pointed out that the papers were sitting on our coffee table in plain sight, and that they had our address on them, which made them relevant to me. I said I wasn't snooping, just trying to understand what was really going on. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe she was going to come clean about the whole situation. But instead, she doubled down. She said her mom needed a stable place to live and that we had the space to help her. She said Linda was getting older and shouldn't have to live alone in some tiny apartment. I asked Sarah why she hadn't discussed this with me before making the decision. I said that changing our living situation permanently was something we should have decided together. I reminded her that we'd never even talked about the possibility of Linda moving in with us. Sarah said she knew I would have said no if she'd asked first. She said I'd never been particularly welcoming to her mother and that she didn't trust me to be fair about the situation. She accused me of being selfish and only caring about my own comfort. That's when I brought up the lease. I told Sarah that while I understood her wanting to help her mother, the legal reality was that I was the only person authorized to make decisions about who lived in our apartment. I said that Linda couldn't stay without my agreement. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Sarah accused me of threatening her and her mother. She said I was using a technicality to control her and that it showed what kind of person I really was. She said she couldn't believe I would use legal documents against my own family. I tried to explain that I wasn't threatening anyone, just pointing out the facts of our situation. I said I was willing to discuss alternatives, but that the current arrangement wasn't working for me. Sarah said there was nothing to discuss. She said her mother was staying, and if I didn't like it, I could find somewhere else to live. She said she wasn't going to abandon her mother just because I was being unreasonable. Things came to a head the following weekend when Linda's sister and brother-in-law came to visit. Sarah had invited them for Sunday dinner, which was the first I'd heard about it. I came home from running errands to find 4 people in my living room, all looking at me like I was the villain in some family drama. Linda's sister, Carol, was a woman in her early 60s with strong opinions about family loyalty. Her husband, Bob, was quieter but clearly on their side. They'd obviously been filled in on the situation because the atmosphere in the room was tense from the moment I walked in. Sarah had made this big dinner with all of Linda's favorite foods. The dining room table was set with our good dishes, and there were flowers in a vase as a centerpiece. It felt like they were celebrating Linda's permanent residence in our home. During dinner, Carol made several comments about how wonderful it was that Linda had found such a welcoming place to live. She talked about how important family support was, especially for older people who might otherwise be isolated. Bob nodded along and mentioned how much Linda seemed to be enjoying the neighborhood. I tried to make polite conversation, but I could feel everyone watching my reactions. When Linda mentioned joining the book club at the community center, Carol said it was so nice that she was putting down roots in such a caring community. After dinner, while Sarah and Linda were in the kitchen cleaning up, Carol cornered me in the living room. She told me that Linda had shared some concerns about feeling unwelcome in the house. She said that family should stick together and that Linda had always been nothing but kind to me. Bob joined the conversation and said that Linda was at an age where stability was really important. He mentioned that moving again would be stressful and potentially harmful to her health. He said that as Linda's son-in-law, I had a responsibility to look out for her well-being. I felt like I was being ganged up on. These people were in my home, eating my food, and lecturing me about my obligations to a woman who had moved in without my permission. I tried to explain that I wasn't against helping Linda, but that the way the situation had been handled was problematic. Carol interrupted me and said that sometimes family emergencies didn't allow for lengthy discussions and committee decisions. She said that Sarah had done the right thing by taking care of her mother, and that I should be supporting her instead of creating problems. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I went to our bedroom and retrieved the lease agreement from our file cabinet. I brought it back to the living room and set it on the coffee table where everyone could see it. I explained that while I understood their concerns about Linda's well-being, the legal reality was that I was the sole leaseholder for our apartment. I said that meant I was responsible for who lived there and that I hadn't agreed to Linda becoming a permanent resident. The room went completely silent. Carol looked at the lease document like it was something offensive. Bob cleared his throat and said that legal technicalities shouldn't override family obligations. Sarah came out of the kitchen and saw the lease on the table. Her face went red with anger and embarrassment. She asked me how I could humiliate her and her family like this. She said I was being cruel and manipulative. Linda appeared behind Sarah, looking confused and hurt. She asked what was happening, and Carol quickly explained that I was threatening to use legal documents to force her to leave. The visit ended shortly after that, with Carol and Bob making their excuses and leaving quickly. Linda went to her room and closed the door. Sarah wouldn't even look at me. The week following the dinner disaster was the worst period of our marriage. Sarah barely spoke to me except when absolutely necessary. She'd get up early and leave for work before I was ready, and she'd stay late at the library to avoid coming home. When she was home, she spent most of her time in Linda's room, and I could hear them talking in low voices. Linda was polite but distant. She'd nod when we passed in the hallway and thank me if I held a door for her, but the easy friendliness from her first week was completely gone. She started eating her meals in her room instead of joining me in the kitchen. I tried to approach Sarah several times to talk about finding a compromise, but she shut down every attempt. She said there was nothing to discuss until I apologized to her mother and agreed to let her stay permanently. She said I'd shown my true colors and that she was disappointed in the person I'd turned out to be. The house felt like a war zone. I'd come home from work and feel the tension the moment I walked through the door. Simple things like watching TV or making coffee became complicated because I never knew if I was intruding on some conversation or plan between Sarah and Linda. I started staying late at the office just to avoid the atmosphere at home. I'd find reasons to work on projects that could have waited, anything to delay facing another evening of cold silence and hostile looks. My coworkers noticed that I seemed stressed, but I didn't want to discuss my personal problems at work. One evening, I came home to find Sarah packing a suitcase. She told me she was going to stay at her friend Jennifer's place for a few days. She said she needed space to think about our relationship and figure out what she wanted to do. I asked her if we could talk before she left, but she said she'd already heard everything I had to say. She reminded me that I had the power to fix the situation by simply accepting her mother as a permanent member of our household. She said the choice was mine, but that she couldn't continue living with someone who would threaten her family. After Sarah left, Linda and I were alone in the house for the first time since she'd moved in. It was incredibly awkward. We moved around each other carefully, making minimal conversation. She made dinner for herself and offered to make some for me, but I declined and ordered pizza instead. That night, lying in bed alone, I realized that my marriage was probably over. Sarah had made it clear that accepting Linda permanently was non-negotiable, and I couldn't bring myself to agree to a living situation that I'd had no voice in creating. We were at an impasse, and neither of us seemed willing to compromise. I thought about calling Mike for legal advice about separation and divorce, but I wasn't ready to take that step yet. Part of me still hoped that Sarah would come home, and we could find a way to work things out. But as the days passed with no contact from her, that hope was fading fast. Sarah stayed at Jennifer's for almost 2 weeks. During that time, Linda and I developed a strange, polite coexistence. She continued with her daily routines, and I did my best to stay out of her way. Neither of us mentioned Sarah's absence or talked about the future. Finally, Sarah called and asked if she could come by to pick up some more clothes. She said she wanted to talk, but that she was bringing Jennifer with her for support. I agreed, hoping that maybe we could find some middle ground. When they arrived, Sarah looked tired and sad. Jennifer stayed in the living room with Linda while Sarah and I went to our bedroom. She sat on the bed and I sat in the chair by the window, maintaining physical distance that reflected our emotional state. Sarah told me that she'd been doing a lot of thinking about our relationship and what she wanted from life. She said she'd realized that we had fundamentally different values when it came to family obligations. She said she couldn't be married to someone who would put legal documents before family loyalty. I tried to explain one more time that it wasn't about the legal documents, but about the process and the lack of communication. I said I would have been willing to discuss Linda moving in if we'd approached it as partners making a joint decision. Sarah said she didn't believe that. She said my reaction to Linda's presence had shown her that I wasn't the kind of person who would prioritize family needs over personal comfort. She said she needed to be with someone who would support her decisions about caring for her mother. We talked for about an hour, but it became clear that we weren't going to reconcile. Sarah said she wanted to separate officially and start divorce proceedings. She said she'd found a 2-bedroom apartment across town where she and Linda could live together. I felt sad but also relieved. The constant tension and conflict had been exhausting, and at least now we were being honest about where we stood. I told Sarah that I thought separation was probably the best option for both of us. We agreed that I would keep the apartment since the lease was in my name. Sarah would take her personal belongings, and the furniture we'd agreed was primarily hers. We decided to handle the divorce through mediation rather than lawyers, hoping to keep things as amicable as possible. Linda was surprisingly gracious when Sarah told her about the separation. She thanked me for letting her stay as long as I had, and said she was sorry that things had worked out this way. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings, and that she'd never intended to cause problems in our marriage. Moving day was emotional, but not dramatic. Sarah packed her things efficiently, and Linda had surprisingly little to move since most of her belongings were still at her old apartment. They hired a small moving truck, and by evening, the house was quiet and empty in a way it hadn't been in months. Epilogue. That was 6 months ago, and I'm still living in the same apartment. Sarah and Linda seem to be doing well in their new place. I hear updates occasionally through mutual friends, and apparently Linda has become very involved in community activities and has made several close friends. Sarah and I finalized our divorce last month. It was sad but not bitter. We both acknowledged that we'd handled the situation poorly and that maybe we weren't as compatible as we'd thought. She's dating someone new now, a guy who apparently gets along great with Linda. I've been thinking a lot about whether I could have handled things differently. Maybe if I'd been more welcoming from the start, or if I'd tried harder to find a compromise, we could have worked it out. But I also think Sarah was wrong to make such a major decision without consulting me. Looking back, I realized that the lease was just a symbol of a deeper problem in our marriage. We didn't communicate well about important issues, and we had different ideas about how decisions should be made. The situation with Linda just brought those problems to the surface. I'm dating again now, taking things slowly. I've learned that I need to be more upfront about my expectations and boundaries from the beginning. If I ever live with someone again, we're definitely going to have clear conversations about things like family obligations and decision-making processes. The apartment feels peaceful now, but sometimes I miss the energy of having other people around. I've thought about getting a roommate, but for now, I'm enjoying having my space back and being able to make my own decisions about my home.